Lion begs gorilla for help. You won't believe what happened next. The savannah breathed with the rhythm of eternity, each exhale carrying the scent of dust and promise. Beneath the sprawling canopy of an ancient acacia, the pride rested in that liquid stillness that belongs only to creatures who understand the sacred mathematics of survival. Golden bodies draped across the earth like living sculptures, each muscle relaxed yet ready, each breath synchronized with the pulse of the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly toward horizons that shimmered with heat and possibility. The afternoon light filtered through leaves that had witnessed countless seasons of birth and death, casting shifting patterns that danced across the tawny coats of the resting lions. This was sanctuary time, when the harsh sun demanded stillness, when even the most restless spirits found peace in the shade. The air hung heavy with the drowsy contentment of creatures who had claimed their place in the intricate web of life through millennia of adaptation and strength. Yet within this tableau of perfect stillness, one small form stirred with the irrepressible energy of youth. A golden cub, its coat still bearing the soft texture of infancy, lifted its head with eyes that sparkled with the kind of curiosity that both delights and terrifies those who understand the price of wonder in an unforgiving world. The cub's mother, a magnificent lioness whose scars spoke of battles won and wisdom earned, dozed with one protective paw extended toward her offspring. Even in sleep, maintaining the vigilant posture of motherhood, the cub's attention was captured by something that seemed to materialize from the very essence of magic itself, an iridescent blue butterfly, its wings catching the dappled sunlight and transforming it into fragments of pure enchantment. The delicate creature danced through the air with an otherworldly grace, each flutter creating patterns that seemed to mock the laws of gravity and logic. To the young lion's eyes, this was not merely an insect, but a living jewel, a piece of the sky that had broken free to play among earthbound creatures. Mesmerized by the butterfly's ethereal ballet, the cub rose to its feet with the careful deliberation of one who doesn't want to disturb the spell. The butterfly hovered just beyond reach, its wings creating tiny whirlwinds of possibility in the still air. Step by cautious step, the cub followed, drawn by an attraction that transcended hunger or play. This was the pure magnetism of beauty calling to innocence. The pride remained lost in their afternoon dreams, unaware that one of their own was being led away by forces as old as wonder itself. The lioness shifted slightly, her protective instincts registering some subtle change in her environment. But sleep held her in its embrace, just long enough for tragedy to begin weaving its web. The butterfly led the cub away from the protective circle of the pride, away from the safety of familiar scents and sounds, toward the base of another acacia, where sunlight created a natural cathedral of light and shadow. Here, golden beams pierced through the canopy, creating an almost spiritual atmosphere where dust motes danced like tiny prayers and the very air seemed to hum with possibility. The cub paused, momentarily overwhelmed by the beauty of this secret place, its young heart swelling with the joy of discovery. But beneath this surface of divine beauty, death waited with the patience of something that had learned to use wonder as its most effective trap. The thick grass around the acacia's base rustled with movements that had nothing to do with wind, movements that spoke of coiled power and ancient hunger. The earth here held different scents, the musk of predator, the metallic tang of previous kills, the subtle wrongness that should have warned any creature with more experience than curiosity. From the deceptive tranquility of the tall grass, an African rock python emerged like a nightmare-given form, its body, thick as a fallen tree trunk and marked with patterns that seemed to shift and writhe even when the massive creature was still, uncoiled with the terrible grace of something that had perfected the art of killing over millions of years of evolution. The python's eyes, cold and calculating, fixed upon the cub with the focused intensity of a predator that never doubted its ability to claim its prey. The strike came with the explosive speed of lightning made flesh. One moment the cub was reaching toward the butterfly. The next, it was trapped within coils that tightened with the inexorable force of a closing fist. The python's body encircled the small lion like a living rope, each muscular segment designed for one purpose: to squeeze the life from anything caught within its embrace. The cub's terrified cry pierced the afternoon stillness, a sound that carried all the anguish of innocence, meeting cruelty, of wonder, transformed into nightmare. That cry reached the pride like a physical blow, shattering the peaceful afternoon and replacing it with the razor-sharp clarity of crisis. The lioness erupted from sleep with the explosive power of maternal instinct unleashed, her powerful body launching across the ground with a grace that spoke of desperation transformed into deadly purpose. Her roar shattered the air, a sound that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, raw and primal, and filled with the kind of rage that could reshape landscapes. She reached the python within seconds, her claws extended and her fangs bared, launching herself at the massive snake with all the fury of a mother defending her young. But the python, ancient and experienced in the mathematics of death, simply tightened its coils further. Each attempt the lioness made to reach her cub only seemed to trigger a more crushing response from the snake. She bit and clawed at the python's hide, her attacks leaving marks but finding no purchase against scales that had evolved to deflect far more desperate assaults than hers. The python's body was a fortress of muscle and bone, each coil reinforcing the others, creating a prison that tightened with every breath the cub tried to take. The lioness circled the massive snake, looking for an opening, a weakness, any point where her strength might overcome the python's crushing advantage. But with each passing second, her cub's struggles grew weaker. Its cri fanter, and the terrible reality began to settle over her that her strength alone might not be enough. Not far from this unfolding tragedy, Samuel Green walked the savannah with the measured pace of someone who had spent decades learning to read the subtle languages of the wilderness. At 73, his body moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his eyes remained sharp, trained by a lifetime of observation to notice details that others might miss. His weathered hands held a field notebook, its pages filled with decades of careful observations, sketches, and theories about the complex relationships that govern life in this harsh paradise. Samuel had come to Africa as a young man, filled with romantic notions about wildlife and adventure. Decades of teaching wildlife biology had refined those dreams into something deeper, a profound respect for the intricate balances that allowed life to flourish in conditions that would destroy anything less perfectly adapted. Retirement had brought him back to the field, not as a conqueror of nature, but as a student who understood that there were still lessons to be learned. It's still mysteries to be uncovered in the endless classroom of the wild. His attention was caught by something that made his trained eye pause, a trail of fresh blood droplets leading away from the main game trails, too large to be from a small animal, too scattered to suggest a successful hunt. The pattern spoke of struggle, of something being dragged or fighting to escape. Samuel's scientific mind began cataloging possibilities even as his heart rate increased with the anticipation of discovery. Following the blood trail required all of Samuel's field experience. The drops led him through terrain that grew increasingly difficult, away from the well-worn paths and into areas where the grass grew taller and the shadows deeper. Each step demanded careful placement, not just for his own safety, but to avoid disturbing whatever scene he might encounter. The blood was fresh enough to glisten in the sunlight, recent enough that whatever had caused it might still be unfolding. The trail led him around a cluster of acacia trees, their thorny branches, creating natural barriers that channeled his movement toward what felt increasingly like a predetermined destination. As he approached a clearing where the afternoon light created a natural amphitheater, Samuel began to hear sounds that made his blood freeze, the desperate roars of a lioness in distress, punctuated by smaller cries that spoke of something young and terrified. When Samuel finally reached a position where he could see the scene clearly, his scientific training warred with the simple human horror of witnessing suffering. The massive python had wrapped itself around the lion cub with the methodical efficiency of a machine designed for killing. The lioness paced around the snake, her movements growing more frantic as she searched for some way to break through the python's defenses. But what truly stopped Samuel's breath was what he saw next. A large silverback gorilla had emerged from the tree line and was observing the scene with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. Samuel had studied interspecies relationships his entire career, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what happened next. The lioness, in her desperation, actually approached the gorilla, her movements indicating not aggression, but something that looked remarkably like supplication. The gorilla's response defied everything Samuel thought he knew about animal behavior. Instead of retreating or showing aggression, the massive primate moved closer to the scene, its intelligent eyes assessing the situation with what appeared to be genuine concern. When the gorilla's gaze met Samuel's across the clearing, the old scientist felt something shift in his understanding of the natural world. The gorilla began moving towards Samuel, its massive frame covering ground with surprising grace. There was no threat in its approach, no display of dominance or territoriality. Instead, Samuel read something in the creature's eyes that seemed impossible, a kind of urgent communication, as if the gorilla understood that the human represented the only hope for resolving the crisis unfolding before them. Samuel's hands trembled as he reached for the bush knife he had carried on field expeditions for over 4 decades. The blade had cut through countless obstacles during his research, had cleared paths through dense vegetation, and carved samples from trees. But never had he imagined using it to intervene directly in a life-or-death struggle between predators. The weight of the knife felt different now, heavier with the responsibility of life and death. Approaching the python required every ounce of courage Samuel had accumulated over a lifetime of facing dangerous situations. The massive snake's attention was focused on maintaining its crushing grip on the cub. But Samuel knew that any sudden movement could redirect that lethal focus onto him. His years of study had taught him that pythons were most vulnerable at their midsection, where the muscle structure was designed for crushing rather than defense. The lioness watched his approach with eyes that seemed to burn with desperate hope. Samuel had studied animal behavior for decades, but nothing had prepared him for the moment, when those golden eyes met his and seemed to communicate something that transcended species boundaries. In that gaze, he read not the wild aggression of a predator, but the desperate pleading of a mother watching her child die. The gorilla positioned itself nearby, its presence somehow both protective and encouraging. Samuel found himself operating on instincts he didn't know he possessed, drawing strength from the unspoken alliance that had formed between 3 species, united by nothing more than the imperative to preserve life. The gorilla's eyes seemed to urge him forward, and Samuel realized he was no longer thinking of his companions as animals, but as allies in a desperate mission. Samuel's first strategy was to use his walking staff to distract the python, hoping to break its concentration enough to loosen its grip on the cub. The wooden stick struck the snake's hide with a sound like hitting leather over stone, and the python's massive head swung toward this new threat. For a moment, the coils loosened slightly, and Samuel thought he might be able to free the cub with minimal violence. But the python's response was swift and terrifying. The massive body writhed with shocking speed, the coils tightening even more severely around the now barely conscious cub. The force of the snake's movement nearly knocked Samuel to the ground, and he realized that half measures would not be enough. The cub's life was measured in seconds now, and only decisive action could save it. Drawing his knife with hands that shook despite decades of field experience, Samuel identified the spot where he would need to strike: the python's midsection, where the coils were tightest around the cub, presented the best target for a blow that might force the snake to release its prey. But reaching that spot would require getting close enough to the massive predator that any mistake would likely be fatal. The first strike with the knife sent sparks flying as the blade scraped against scales that had evolved to deflect the claws and fangs of Africa's most dangerous predators. The python's hide was like armor, resistant to anything but the most determined assault. Samuel's palm split open against the knife's handle as the blade's impact jarred through his entire arm. But he maintained his grip and struck again. Blood from Samuel's wounded hand mixed with the dust of the savannah, creating patterns on the ground that seemed to speak of sacrifice and determination. Each blow of the knife required him to expose himself to the python's potential counterattack. But the gorilla's presence nearby gave him a courage he had never known he possessed. The massive primate seemed to be standing guard, ready to intervene if the snake's attention turned fully toward the human. The lioness, understanding somehow that this human was trying to save her cub, held herself in check despite every instinct that must have been screaming at her to attack anything that came near her offspring. Her restraint was perhaps more remarkable than Samuel's courage, a predator allowing a potential threat to operate freely near her most precious possession because some deeper wisdom told her that cooperation was the only path to survival. Strike after strike, Samuel worked at the python's coils, each blow precisely placed to maximize damage while minimizing the risk of harming the cub trapped within. The knife's edge, worn smooth by decades of use, and finally began to find purchase against the snake's hide. Deep cuts appeared where the blade had struck repeatedly in the same spots, and the python's crushing grip began to show signs of weakening. The battle became a test of endurance as much as courage. Samuel's arms burned with the effort of repeatedly striking the heavily armored snake. His breathing grew ragged with exhaustion and stress, and sweat mixed with blood to create a slick coating on his hands that made gripping the knife increasingly difficult. But with each successful strike, the cub's struggles grew slightly stronger, indicating that the crushing pressure was beginning to relent. The turning point came when Samuel managed to drive his blade deep enough into the python's midsection to reach vulnerable tissue beneath the protective scales. The massive snake's response was immediate and violent, its entire body convulsed with pain and surprise. In the crushing coils loosening as the creature's focus shifted from killing its prey to protecting itself from this unexpected and persistent threat. In that moment of loosened coils, Samuel saw his opportunity. Dropping his knife, he reached into the gap created by the python's momentary distraction and grasped the limp form of the lion cub. The small body felt terrifyingly fragile in his hands, warm but barely breathing, its golden fur matted with saliva and the residue of its ordeal. With a strength born of desperation, Samuel pulled the cub free from the python's weakened grip and stumbled backward, cradling the precious burden against his chest. The python, wounded and confused, and began to retreat into the tall grass, its massive body moving with less of the fluid grace it had displayed during the attack. The snake seemed to understand that its opportunity had passed, that the combination of forces arrayed against it had proven too formidable to overcome. As it disappeared into the vegetation, Samuel felt a profound sense of relief mixed with the trembling aftermath of adrenaline and exhaustion. The lioness approached slowly, her eyes never leaving the small form in Samuel's arms. There was no aggression in her movement now, only the desperate hope of a mother who had watched her child pulled back from the edge of death. Samuel gently placed the cub on the ground between them, then stepped back to give the lioness room to reclaim her offspring. The reunion between mother and cub was almost too intimate to witness. The lioness immediately began licking her offspring with a gentle persistence that spoke of love beyond human comprehension. Her rough tongue cleaned away the evidence of the python's attack, while simultaneously providing the stimulation needed to encourage the cub's weakened systems back to full function. The small lion's breathing gradually grew stronger. Its eyes began to focus more clearly, and tiny mewling sounds indicated that its vocal cords had not been permanently damaged by the crushing pressure. Samuel stood watching this scene with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, suddenly understanding that he had been privileged to witness something that transcended the normal boundaries of species and experience. The gorilla remained nearby, its intelligent eyes moving between Samuel, the lioness, and her recovering cub with what appeared to be satisfaction at the successful outcome of their unlikely alliance. The lioness looked up from her cub to meet Samuel's eyes directly, and in that gaze he read gratitude of a depth and purity that no human had ever expressed to him. There was recognition there as well, an acknowledgement that this strange, upright creature had risked his own life to save her most precious possession. The communication between them transcended language, transcended species, transcended everything except the fundamental understanding shared by all creatures who value life above their own safety. As the immediate crisis passed, Samuel became aware of his own injuries. His hand throbbed where the knife had cut into his palm. His arms ached from the repeated impacts of striking the python's armored hide, and his entire body shook with the delayed reaction to the stress and danger he had just endured. But these physical discomforts seemed insignificant compared to the profound sense of purpose and connection he felt. The gorilla approached Samuel one final time, moving with the same gentle deliberation it had shown throughout the crisis. For a moment, the two beings regarded each other across the vast evolutionary distance that separated their species, yet connected by the shared experience of having worked together to preserve life. The gorilla's eyes held what Samuel could only interpret as gratitude and respect before the massive creature turned and disappeared back into the trees from which it had emerged. Samuel retrieved his blood-stained knife from where it had fallen, cleaning the blade on his field shirt before returning it to its sheath. The weapon felt different now, transformed from a tool of research into an instrument that had served the cause of life itself. He would never be able to hold it again without remembering this moment, without feeling the weight of the responsibility that came with the power to intervene in nature's most fundamental processes. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the savanna and painting the sky with the first hints of the spectacular colors that would mark day's end. The acacia tree, under which the drama had unfolded, stood unchanged, its ancient branches continuing their eternal dance with the wind, indifferent to the miracle that had just occurred beneath its canopy. Samuel began the walk back to his camp, his steps slower and more deliberate than they had been earlier in the day. The adrenaline was fading from his system, leaving behind a profound exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical tiredness. He had been changed by the events of the afternoon, marked by an experience that challenged everything he thought he understood about the relationships between species and the possibilities for communication and cooperation in the natural world. Behind him, the lioness continued to minister to her cub, her attention focused entirely on ensuring that her offspring would recover fully from its ordeal. The cub's strength was returning gradually, its movements becoming more coordinated and its responses to its mother's attentions more vigorous. The immediate danger had passed, but the healing process would continue for hours or perhaps days as the young lion recovered from both the physical trauma and the psychological shock of its near-death experience. As Samuel walked, he found himself struggling to process what he had witnessed. The gorilla's behavior defied every principle of animal psychology he had ever learned. Gorillas were not known for their cooperative relationships with other species, particularly with potential threats like humans. Yet this individual had not only failed to show aggression, but had actively encouraged Samuel to intervene in the crisis, had stood guard during the dangerous work of freeing the cub, and had shown what could only be described as satisfaction at the successful outcome. The lioness's behavior was equally unprecedented in Samuel's experience. Lions were apex predators, evolved to view humans as either threats to be eliminated or prey to be consumed. The idea that a lioness would trust a human enough to allow him to approach her endangered cub, would restrain her own protective instincts long enough for that human to work, was something that challenged the very foundations of what he thought he knew about predator behavior. That evening, in his tent, Samuel sat before his field journal with a pen that seemed almost too heavy to hold. How could he possibly record what he had experienced in language that would convey its true significance? The scientific terminology that had served him throughout his career seemed inadequate to capture the emotional and spiritual, the dimensions of what had occurred. Yet he felt compelled to try, to create some record that might help others understand the profound possibilities for connection that existed between species when life itself was at stake. The letter he eventually wrote to his former student represented his best attempt to translate the day's events into words that might convey their deeper meaning. But even as he wrote, Samuel knew that no description could truly capture the look in the lioness's eyes, the intelligence and compassion he had seen in the gorilla's face, or the profound sense of unity he had felt when three very different species had worked together to preserve life. The night sounds of the savanna surrounded his tent as Samuel sealed the letter. The calls of nocturnal predators and the rustle of small creatures moving through the grass, creating a symphony that spoke of the endless cycle of life and death that governed this ancient landscape. Somewhere out there, the lioness was probably still watching over her cub, ensuring its continued recovery and preparing to guide it back to the safety of the pride. The gorilla had returned to whatever group or territory it claimed, carrying with it the memory of an afternoon when the normal rules of survival had been suspended in favor of something higher and more noble. And the cub, innocent catalyst for the entire drama, would grow up bearing no conscious memory of the day when three very different creatures had risked everything to ensure its survival. Samuel lay in his sleeping bag, staring up through the tense mesh at stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than he had ever seen them. The events of the day played through his mind repeatedly, each replay revealing new details and raising new questions about the nature of consciousness, communication, and compassion in the animal kingdom. He had entered the day as a retired professor With decades of experience studying wildlife behavior, he was ending it as something else entirely, a witness to possibilities that had never appeared in any textbook, a participant in a miracle that challenged everything he thought he understood about the boundaries between species. The wound on his hand throbbed with a dull ache that would remind him for days to come of the price paid for intervention. But it was a pain he would bear gladly. He had learned that sometimes the most profound truths were written not in academic journals but in moments of crisis, when the artificial boundaries between species dissolved in the face of a shared commitment to preserving life, as sleep finally claimed him. Samuel's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for having been allowed to witness and participate in something that had expanded his understanding of what was possible in a world that still held mysteries beyond human comprehension. Tomorrow he would return to the routine of observation and documentation, but he would do so as a man who had been fundamentally changed by an encounter with grace in one of its purest forms. The savanna continued its ancient rhythms around his sleeping form, predator and prey, locked in the eternal dance of survival, while somewhere in the darkness a lion cub slept safely beside its mother, alive, because three very different species had found a way to communicate across the vast distances that normally separated their worlds. The butterfly that had started it all was long gone, but its brief dance had set in motion events that would ripple outward through the years, carried forward in the memory of an old man who had learned that miracles were not only possible but necessary in a world where wonder and terror walked hand in hand across landscapes vast enough to contain both beauty and horror in equal measure.